Hi, I'm Brandy.
And I'm Jen.
And this is
Keeping It Simple.
Hi, I'm Brandy and this is Jen, and this is Keeping It Simple. We are on episode 4, and in today's episode, we are discussing the symbolism around grapes, the fruit grapes, which most people would not think is too, symbolically important or esoteric, but it actually has millennia worth of what do you want to say significance, whether it's religious or just in cultural food, etc. So Jen, when it comes to grapes, what for you, what are some keywords, like if a grape were to show up in somebody's life, or to stand out, what would be something of significance for you? Like what was a keyword that you would think of?
Definitely abundance, prosperity, liberation. Um, let's see, overindulgence. There's definitely the flip side of that grape, which we'll get into. Overindulgence, revelry, celebration. What you got?
So I mean, I have the same thing, but you're looking at, because I know I tend to go more the religious side of things, and so you're looking at sacrifice and the divine wisdom. You're looking at the mysteries. And that's one of the most esoteric symbols for me.
Oh,
I
and
love the
rebirth.
grapes. Yeah,
Rebirth. That's one of the biggest ones in my mind as far as a word. Rebirth.
yeah. All right. So, do you want to kick us off, or do you want me to start things off with some? What do you have?
You
What do
go
you want
first,
me?
girl. I'm gonna eat a grape while you
Okay,
go.
so this one makes me excited. Um, Most people, because if they don't know, I am a tarot reader by profession, and Jen is a graphic designer, and she has done some tarot decks, of which one of them, tarot disassembled, has grapes throughout the deck. Now, Jen, with tarot assembled, which is the new deck you're releasing, which is based on symbols, is there a grape card?
There is a grape card because grapes are prolific in the tarot.
Okay. And in your deck, why, when you say prolific, and I know you and you go down rabbit holes like I do, what is it that prompted you? Because there's so many symbols in the tarot. What prompted you to hone in on grape? Why do you say it's prolific
Well,
or
for one,
significant?
it shows up in a lot of cards. We have the devil, the 3 of cups, 7 of pentacles, 9 of pentacles, 10 of pentacles, king of pentacles, 4 of wands, 5 of wands. It's all over the tarot. These grapes show up everywhere. So prolific in the sheer number of tarot cards that they worked this imagery into.
And if you're not familiar with tarot, the deck that Jen has done her deck based off of is the Rider-Waite-Smith, which was done by Pamela Coleman Smith, was the artist. Now, that is Golden Dawn, and Golden Dawn was well versed in myths, legends, religions, and one of the earliest depictions of the grape. Do you have any idea where it comes from, Jim?
The earliest depiction, Egypt,
Older.
Sumeria.
Correct. It is
Mm.
Sumeria. So in Sumeria, the cuneiform, because they did not work in our written language like we have, their written cuneiform, their form of writing, if you're not familiar with that, I have to remember some people have no idea what we're talking about, but it's their form of writing. The symbol essentially for the vine is what it was the symbol for life. So that's where it began, that they know of, is back to Babylonia, Sumeria, which then progressed to Egypt. And interestingly, Egypt and Sumeria are like my jam. Anything Anunnaki is my jam. And so if you look at, it's really cool. If you go look at some of the tombs from Egypt, they actually have grapevines painted on them. And it's, again, that extension in life after death, that resurrection, that rebirth into the afterlife.
Well,
It's
didn't they
uh,
also have find actual grape seeds left over
correct,
in some of the tombs? Because they thought they would
correct.
need all those things in the afterlife, so they want to make sure they had juicy
Yeah.
goodness in the afterlife.
And grapes was one of the ones that was most significant in a tomb, which I find just wildly interesting
Yeah.
because it is such a common fruit that I think, if somebody talks about like the pomegranate, it's more exotic to us. But the
Right.
grape is just so common that I think people don't realize the cultural and religious significance it's played through the history of man.
Right. Right. And it's an abundant fruit in modern times as well as ancient times, as far as just the sheer numbers as a crop that, have been harvested all over the world.
Yeah. So I know you are big into Greco-Roman stuff. So what do you got Greco-Roman? Because I know I have an idea, is what I should say, of some of the things that you have, just because the Greco-Roman nexus.
Well, Greco-Roman, you have Dionysus, who is the god of wine, revelry, ecstasy, madness, the harvest. He's kind of the god, and he's literally the god of grapes. So he is usually depicted wearing grapes around his head or with grapes. And then farther down, his counterpart was Bacchus. And I love all the Dionysus Bacchus energy. I'm from Louisiana. I've been to Mardi Gras several times. Any Mardi Gras is essentially a Bacchanalia or a Dionysia. That's essentially, it's that level of revelry and kind of sheer, like, there's not full on orgies in the street at Mardi Gras like they used to have back in the day at the old Bacchanalias and Dionysia. But there's definitely there's some, nudity, there's some craziness, there's some there's some high level of revelry. But to back up a minute, I don't mean to start throwing out those words. So a Bacchanalia would have been the festival in honor of Bacchus. A Dionysia would have been the festival in honor of Dionysus. They're very, very similar. These Greek and Roman gods and goddesses usually had a counterpart. The Greek came first, and then the Romans kind of took that, and sometimes they changed it up, but sometimes they kept it very similar. I love Dionysus because he's kind of this bad boy, party boy, but with depth as far as his characterization. And he's even one that he gets grouped into some of the big ones, the big name gods from the Greek pantheon, but he's really not a full god. He was born of Zeus, the main big daddy god in the sky, and a mortal woman. So he's technically a demigod. But he's given that level of, top notchness that they kind of reserve for the big name gods. Quite often we find in depictions in history. Now, do you want me just to go on about Bacchus and Dionysus? Because they definitely got some stuff.
It's interesting because one of the things that I was familiar with is in Greece, the four seasons are represented by four women, and each of those women has different attributes. And autumn is the one associated with the grape. She would actually carry a basket, and the basket would have bunches of grapes in it. So that's one that you can actually see depicted in a lot of Roman art that has not necessarily the god or goddess nexus to it, but it's just as a way that they represented the seasons, which is interesting to me because grapes are associated traditionally in a lot of other places with the end of winter and the beginning of spring, the fruitfulness. So it's very interesting to me. And I think part of that is probably, they're on the Southern Hemisphere, right?
Yes.
They're classified as Southern Hemisphere. Well, that may be why. I mean, their seasons are different from what our classical seasons are here in North America. So I'm sure that probably has something to do with it. It's the swapping of the seasons. So there's that. And then this one was one that I don't remember where I learned about it, and I had to write down so that I don't botch the pronunciation. It's Osophoria. Have you heard of that? Osophoria?
I don't think I have.
And it's a Greek holiday, and it's the festival of the carrying of grape clusters, and it is ancient. So that's interesting to me because they would actually carry the giant grape clusters. So again, it has that, with Bacchus and Dionysus, it has different connotations in terms of sexual energy, sacrificial energy. I know that the smashing of the grapes was something that was seen as like blood. And so that it was like the sacrificing of the god, the dismemberment of the god, the partaking in the blood of the god, which people who are Christians or are familiar with Christian faith, that will sound familiar to you.
Yes, the
So
sacrament.
it's very interesting that you have that back in that time. Now, there was one thing that I was not sure of when it came to. Okay, so this is interesting to me. So Dionysus is Greek, Bacchus is Roman.
Right.
And so they kind of have that same meaning of like wealth and pleasure, luxury, which can be pleasure, can be sexual pleasure, intoxication, that sort of thing, right? What was interesting to me was with Bacchus, it was talking about it's like kind of like I didn't really try and go too far down the rabbit hole, but they were really focusing on fertility in Rome. But I did not see that with Dionysus and Greek, which you would think if in the Greek pantheon you have autumn associated with the grapes, and that's, I mean, yes, that's not springtime. So that's what does that make sense? Like I'm looking at the autumn because I guess maybe my brain
Yeah.
is wrapping around our autumn versus the association in Rome being fertility. That flip side. Does that make sense? It seems like
It does. It does. And I think that's part of the evolution that the Greek gods and goddesses that kind of came first. Quite often the Romans would evolve them in their properties and kind of what they stood for. And I think you're correct. I think Dionysus was a lot less associated with fertility. He really was associated more almost with
that's
primalness because his festivals were very much about this primal letting go and revelry and
that
sheer
liberation.
ecstasy,
Yeah.
liberation. My favorite thing as far as tying Dionysus and the grape itself to liberation is when they held these great Dionysia, which was the festivals in honor of Dionysus, which would last days. It was the one time in civilization and for that time period where everybody was allowed to have the same equal rights, essentially, because normally women, enslaved peoples, servants, all of these kind of in the class system, these people that weren't allowed to really have full freedoms were allowed during the Dionysia to celebrate like everybody else and be free for those several days. And so I love that it's like he was, for them, especially for the lesser people, he was the great liberator. And then obviously you get into like wine and what grapes make and how wine liberates us sometimes of our, all of our
Inhibitions. Yeah.
inhibitions and stuff too, which gets into kind of another layer of
Well,
it.
I find it very interesting because you go from that Greek more again, like you said, more primal, it is sexual, it is pleasure, it is sacrifice, it is that liberation. So when you move into the Roman, you really do have the sexuality and the fertility side, which you did see the sexuality with Dionysus. I find that very interesting in the way that the seasons change. So again, you have one talking about the end of winter, and then going into spring, whereas you have the Greeks that are focusing on that autumn time. So I'm
Right,
wondering again if
right.
it's still, even though it's different from our time, like our
Mhm.
seasons, I'm pretty sure they're in the southern hemisphere.
Yeah,
So it's dealing with, I would be curious if anybody knew that, what the discrepancy was. I
right.
actually tried to look like why, and I couldn't find anything really on why, but I didn't go too far down into mythological, you know, rabbit holes where you can get lost for 5 days trying to find
Right.
one answer. Yeah.
Which you can.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's almost like Dionysus grows up and matures into the Bacchus counterpart because Dionysus is actually often even depicted in different forms, sometimes very young and very youthful. And then other artists would depict him as kind of this older, portly dad bod kind of guy. And Bacchus
Yeah.
comes along, and Bacchus is more often than not, Bacchus is rarely depicted as a youthful, young person. So it's almost like the seasons literally changed where they had all the sexual energy that Dionysus brought with this revelry. And then Bacchus comes along and that sexual energy turns to fertility and the actual usage of that sexual energy. So it's kind of like a
It's
maturing,
interesting
just like a grape matures on the vine, if you will.
because, well, and you have that same sense of when you're talking about the maturity and the development of, and then you're talking about, the way in which the grape essentially evolves because you have these Sumerians, then you have the Egyptians. So you're dealing with life, and it's moving literally from life to liberation and pleasure to fertility. So in its own timeline, it is seeing the similar thread, but it's also evolving in and of itself, which is
Right.
quite interesting.
Right.
Because then when we turn around and we get into Old Testament, which you can easily say runs right alongside your Romans and your Greeks, it's interesting to me that you have one of the things that stood out. I don't know if you knew this. This is something that's always fascinated me. If you look at a lot of the ancient artwork,
Mm-hmm.
Eve is depicted with grapes, not an apple, and not a fig. So her genitals are covered by a fig leaf. That tends to be Adam. Her genitals are covered by a vine leaf, a grapevine leaf. And she is said to, in the Gnostic Gospels, which is how they depict her, to have consumed grapes, not an apple.
I read that they think that might actually be the forbidden fruit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me because if you follow the Gnostic teachings, the serpent that tempted Eve, first of all, had legs, and there's some if you go into the Gnostic side of stuff, it's really interesting to see the way that, and the Enochian and stuff like that. It's fascinating to me how different it is from what I was taught, in a Methodist church. And so the God, that's what I'll call him, the God associated with the serpent that tempted Eve in the Gnostic teachings was the Hebraic Dionysus. And that's the same God that Noah, was associated with all the way up until the flood.
Okay, that's fascinating. I did not know that.
So it's interesting to me that when you see that connection, when it's the Hebraic Dionysus and this potential that, the forbidden fruit was a grape and that her genitals were covered with a vine leaf.
Right.
There's something else that's really interesting tying to Noah. After the flood, the first thing he planted was a vine.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I love it. See, I'm just picturing that meme with the guy with the yarn and stuff. What do you call it again? What do you were telling me the name for that?
So it's in crime analysis, it's called link analysis.
Link
it's
analysis. I just picture like where everything's tied together. It all ties together.
And here's the really cool part. So when you go even further than that, it is said that the first biblical patriarch that became drunk or intoxicated was Noah. Which, when you think about it, and we'll go down the wine route here in a little bit when we get past the grapes.
Yeah.
But when I started looking at all of these things, I mean, I knew about the Eve stuff and I knew about the Hebraic Dionysus, and just certain things. It's very interesting to me when you start actually putting those pieces together, the way that it's evolved. Then you hit the Greeks and the Romans, and at the same time, you're hitting Old Testament.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
It's very interesting. I have one little other wrinkle about Dionysus I just have to share, because we'll definitely talk about that more especially with winemaking, but how the grape is a huge symbol of rebirth. And Dionysus is born in this kind of really crazy way. So he was impregnated, Zeus impregnated a mortal woman. And Hera, his wife, was pissed, just like she was with all of his affairs, because he had many in the Greek mythologies, many affairs. And she sought revenge on the woman. And she really wanted both of them dead, the baby and the woman. And it's not clear. It's almost like she had not, it's kind of a gruesome sounding scene, but basically Zeus manages to save little baby Dionysus, who's, I don't think, even fully formed yet. And it sews him up into his leg. And so he actually sews him into his own leg and lets him gestate in there to finish gestation. And then eventually, when he's fully gestated, he emerges. And so it's kind of that, again, it brings in that grape, with Dionysus being such a strong tie to grapes. It brings in that rebirth of, he was kind of born once, but it's almost like they're suggesting he was premature because of the event where Hera took her revenge. And Zeus manages to save him and give him another chance at life again. And it's that kind of rebirth, busting out of his father's leg. It's just, I don't know, I just love all those. I love all the rebirth symbology that's tied into grapes, even in Dionysus's stories.
I don't think I've heard that one yet.
And the Greeks were wild, like just the
Yeah, I don't
whole
think
like
I've
sewing
recounted
babies
that
up
one.
into their
Yeah, and
legs.
I've heard sewing of the leg, but
Yeah.
not with him. Not that's not one that I recall. But
Yeah.
did you know, this is a side note, there is a children's book that teaches where babies come from that's modern day, but it's based off of Greco-Roman myths.
Oh, wow.
And it is very not something you want to read to a child. Like it's supposed to be almost like it's like a gag.
Like a
It's yeah.
faux children's book.
Yes,
Like
but
for
it's really
adults.
writ for children, and it's atrocious. But that's
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So here's let me back off of this weird
Sure.
children's book. So you know me, I like to dig into the religious side of stuff. So one thing that I am not Jewish, I am not Christian, but that doesn't mean I don't study it because I find absolute value in it. And people will hear me say that I find the 5 books of Moses and the Bible, New Testament, to be the most profound esoteric books writings there are, if you can dig in per se, instead of just reading things at surface value. And so one of the things, I am a student of 22 Teachings, which is in Los Angeles. For those of you who have never heard of 22 Teachings, it's a Hermetic Kabbalistic school. And we do something each year, which we'll get more into this in the wine. We have a Hebrew teacher. And so our Hebrew teacher, we do Tu B'Shvat, which is, celebration of the trees. Well, it's of nature, but we do this thing where it's the celebration of the trees predominantly. And there is a wine ceremony that we do, which you can use grape juice, and we'll go into that. But I found it interesting because in my studies, I've learned over the last, I don't know how many years it's been at this point, about how sacred grapes, not just wine, but grapes were and are to the Jewish people. When it came to liberation of the Israelites from Egypt, that's a huge one that comes into play because the grape is seen, the vine, the vineyard, that is Israel. That is the kingdom of God. The Israelites, that is the grapes from the promised land, is their future. That's something that is significant. And I had this thing in Revelations that I wanted to read, but I just wanted to backtrack.
Yeah.
When I've learned how important, I mean, I always knew wine was important to Jewish people,
Sure.
and I knew somewhat of the context, but it wasn't until I really started studying, and we had, our Hebrew teacher that was, of course, explaining things more in depth, and we have more than one, but she teaches us Hebrew specifically. And so you start learning, and then it's like, oh, wait a minute. I remember, how they always talked about, I am the vine, you are the branches in Christianity. And I will remember John 15, 1-5, probably for the rest of my life, because that was taught. So you start thinking about that backtracking from Jesus' association to I am the vine, you are the branches, to learning that it actually began with the Israelites and the liberation from the Egyptians in the new promised land. And this is one that got me, and I already told you about Noah planting the vineyard after the flood, which is associated with the tree of life. And with Eve, it's associated with the tree of good and evil, which is interesting. And those are 2 separate things, by the way.
Right.
So, they're separate but interdependent. It's interesting. So in Revelations, this was one that stood out to me. At the end of the time, earthly life will be thrown into the great winepress of the wrath of God, from which will flow an immense river of blood.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
So when you think about it, everything of the earthly affairs, and what have we been talking about grapes represent? Pleasure, things of wealth, things of the physical world.
Right.
But at the same hand, it's talking about being thrown into the wine. And it's interesting, it uses the word wine press of the wrath of God.
Right.
Which we're going to go down the wine route in a minute. But it's very much what we were talking about, that liberation from the physical, the moving away from the physical and into more of that spiritual meaning, which you see is significant with the Israelites predominantly.
Right.
But again, the Gnostics, it is, anyways, I found that interesting.
I think
Did
that's
you
really
see?
interesting. I at a also on the same note of the Judaism, at a Jewish Seder, with which they hold during a Passover, is each adult is responsible for drinking 4 cups of wine,
Mhm.
and they leave a fifth out for the prophet Elijah to represent future redemption and future liberation. So it kind of continues those themes of what you're talking about, the liberation, you know.
Yeah. And in the wine ceremony that we do, ritual, because it's ritual high magic that we do with 22 teachings with Tu B'Shvat is 4 glasses of wine.
Right, so it's
So
similar. Yeah.
it's a particular. I don't know how the Seder rituals are, but I know how we do it, and ours is 4 glasses, and there's certain mixings that have to be done and prayers that have to be done, and it's
Right,
really cool. It's
right.
really cool.
That's wonderful.
So we talked a little bit a minute ago about Christianity as it relates to Jesus taking on that role of I am the vine. This is where we see him taking on that vine role after the Israelites and the vine or the grape being essentially the vineyard of God, and God is the vineyard keeper, right?
Right.
Um, so did you grow up in the Christian church?
I did. I grew up I went in a Methodist environment.
Okay. So do you remember the teachings of I am the vine, you are the branches? Do you
It's
remember that?
it's one of those, like, it's still, I hear it and it sounds so familiar, but I feel very separated from, like, because I will admit I don't go to church anymore, at least not Christian church. um, so it feels like a distant memory, but yes, I'm definitely, it's definitely resonates as something I've heard many a time, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
And it's a popular saying that's
Yeah.
associated, and you'll see oftentimes um, depictions of Jesus, particularly in classical art, with grapes, bunches of grapes. Do you know who else was depicted in different engravings and carvings and art with bunches of grapes?
I'm gonna make a guess because I actually am not sure, but I'm gonna guess Mary Magdalene.
Well, yes, I'm sure there are some out there, but Dionysus.
Oh, okay. Yes, yes, yes. I thought you meant
Yeah.
along the Christian vein.
No,
Sorry.
no, 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 no. And it's interesting to me because you see all these depictions of Dionysus with grapes,
Right,
and then you see Jesus with grapes, and you take apart those same things about sacrifice and dismemberment of the God in order
right,
to partake in the essence of the God through the consumption of the grapes, through the consumption of the wine,
right.
which if you grew up in a Methodist church, you've taken communion before, I'm
Oh,
assuming.
yes. Oh, yes.
Yes. So it's very interesting. And they used, some churches use wine, and then with children, they'll use grape juice. Some just use grape juice. And it's very interesting when you start seeing those threads that just keep winding. And it's like, it's in a new face, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
it's the same package, just in new packaging, right?
Right.
New wrapping. Very interesting. Um, so one of the things that I've seen several times is when they refer to spiritual life or the wine of life, when it deals with Christianity and Jesus. And so it goes back to taking it from that physical form to more of that liberated, alchemical, divine essence form.
Right.
And one of the things that is interesting is you have in Judaism where drinking wine is very much a part of their faith. It's not a it's more than strongly suggested. It is expected, and it is expected that in the more traditional you are. Did you know that Welch's grape juice, who's been around for like 150 years or something like that? Did you know that they have team? So do you know what kosher is? Sorry, I'm
Yes.
like all over the place.
Yes.
Okay, so when it comes to traditional Judaism, they are expected to their food should be kosher, and they have certain rules of how to prepare their food, how to consume their food, stuff like that, which I find wildly fascinating.
Yeah.
And not fascinating as in like, oh, that's weird. It makes sense. And it's so interesting to me. But anyways, Welch's, who has Welch's grape juice that's been around for like 150 years, has teamed up with, I don't remember how many years ago it was, but they teamed up with I forgot the name of so to be kosher, a food must be overseen by a rabbi. It
Right.
can't just, it has to not only abide by the rules, but it has to be overseen in preparation by a rabbi. Welch has teamed up with this, I believe it's a company that's been around, and they produce kosher foods. So like how we would just go to the store and get a prepackaged food, it doesn't mean that it's kosher
Right.
unless it says kosher certified. So Welch's, the biggest producer of grape juice, has teamed up with a kosher producing company, and now they're producing kosher grape juice specifically for the Jewish community because they consume that amount of grape juice and in
Yeah.
lieu of wine oftentimes. Cool.
That's really cool. Yeah.
I mean, it's an old company that,
Yeah.
well, two of them, because they're not, I think they're both, one's like 150 years old. I can't remember. Well, I know Welch's has been around for like a long time. And
Right.
then the kosher company, which I'm not really as familiar with. When I read that, probably should have looked it up because it's been a long time since I've seen it. But I thought to myself, that's really cool. That's cool when you realize, and I'm sure people say, well, it's capitalism, like, Welch's is preying on them. But at the same time, if you can have what is considered some of the best quality grape juice in the world,
Right.
particularly here in the States, provide something that is within the religious belief system of these people, to me, that's just like amazing. That you know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
absolutely. I'm not Jewish, but I think that would be so welcome to be able to go to the grocery store and find kosher certified products that you can just grab and go. And you know what I mean? Like for the
Yeah.
ease and convenience of your life. So I mean,
Well, and
that's wonderful.
if you think about how much Judaism has grown, particularly in the States,
Right.
and you have these certain Sabbaths where people are going to be, the Jewish community is going to be consuming wine and grape juice, because grape juice is the substitute. That's a lot of people going out all at the same time. That would be like New Year's. You know how like around the
Right.
country, around New Year's, it's like, people are stocking champagne and champagne alternatives because it's expected. A certain portion of the population is going to go out and consume these. So to me, it's just very cool that they did it. Yes, I'm sure money has something to do with it with Welch's side, but I just think it's really cool the way that they did it to
Yeah.
serve that community.
I think that's really great.
And on the flip side, this is one thing that I've always found fascinating. So for people who don't know, like, I don't even know if you know this, Jen, but Islam is what I studied for most of graduate school. That's
No, I
because,
didn't know that.
yes. Africa is like my predominant, Southeast Asia, the Maghreb, North Africa, Central Africa, South Africa, but then Southeast Asia. And so because of what I did for a living, and so I've always found it fascinating that in the Jewish community, wine consumption is mandatory. Like it's part of your belief system. In
Right.
Islam, it is forbidden to consume wine of this world. You can consume the wine of God, the essence, the divine essence, but it is forbidden, not because it intoxicates you, but almost because to consume it, from my understanding, would allow you to understand God better. And so it is
Oh,
forbidden to consume it. Does that make sense? Like it's
it
revered as
does.
holy, but you're not
Yeah.
allowed to touch it. So
Yeah.
it's almost like a holy sacrament. Like you just can't touch that. We
It's so
recognize,
sacred you can't even have it. Right.
correct. It's very interesting. And it's interesting
Yeah.
because if you know how, if you look at where Islam is predominantly in the world, it's smack dab in the same area that you have the Hebraic communities. And so you even have the Christian communities there, particularly in North Africa, you have the Coptic Christians that are really heavy in Egypt. And so you've got this overall acknowledgement of the sacredness of wine. One is partake on certain days. The Christian church, when you have communion, then you have the Jewish community that it's all the different Sabbaths and stuff like that. From the 8th day of circumcision that a male child is born, they consume wine. And then you have this other side. You have these 3 monotheistic religions all in the same area that revere it, but in different ways.
Yeah. That's fascinating, isn't it?
To me, that's just like,
Right.
okay,
Mind blowing.
yeah. Did you find anything else before because I keep talking? I do have one more thing before we go into wine, but it kind of has to deal with wine. It's wine in a vine.
Yeah, I have some wine stuff which we can wait on because I have some, I love to go into pop culture and modern stuff. So
Oh
I
Lord.
have one little tale about wine, but we can wait till we hit wine a little bit deeper. But also one thing I thought was interesting about just because I like my science facts as well. Grapes are one of the most naturally yeasty fruits out there. So there's certain fruits that are definitely higher as far as their production of yeast naturally. And grapes, the riper they get, the more they produce yeast naturally, which probably is why one of the reasons in ancient times they pretty quickly realized they were great for fermenting and making into wine.
Mm.
But the yeast is interesting because I found this website that makes it was a Jewish bakery and they make the challah, which is the Jewish
Yeah.
bread, and they were describing the spiritual properties of yeast. And I thought this was so beautiful, especially likening it back to the grape. They said yeast is what enables our dough to rise. It represents growth and expansion. When we add the yeast, we should think of each one of our family members and friends and pray that they grow and expand in their emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being. We wish for our homes to expand, that we may be able to invite guests. We desire for our children to expand their minds with Torah knowledge. I just thought that was so beautiful
Yeah.
that the yeast, they were talking about the making of the challah bread and even taking each ingredient and talking about the kind of the symbolic spiritual significance. So when I saw yeast, I just love that because the grape is one of the highest yeasty fruits out there that produces yeast naturally.
So there is two things I want to add to that. One, if you like to make French toast, challah bread is the best bread to make it with. So that's just a side note. I used to make before I had to go grain free, I used to make French toast with challah bread for Christmas, for the winter
Ooh,
solstice through Christmas, and it is amazing.
yum, yum.
Now, this is a kind of side note that has to do with the Torah. But on the Hierophant card,
And tarot.
okay, which is key 5, the backs of the heads of the 2 monks are actually challah breads. That's what
What?
that's what their shapes came
Get
from.
out.
Well, they are essentially
I'm
what.
so glad we're friends. I learn new stuff from you every single time we talk. I'm
So
like,
when you think
that card.
about,
I'm like, what?
yeah, so when you think about when you see their back of their heads, the ring
Yeah.
where they have no hair in the middle, it is
Yeah.
a challah bread loaf.
That is that's the coolest thing. That just blew my mind
So
because I did not know that.
look at the older
Yeah.
depictions of the cards. So it's very
Right.
interesting. And then you think of that card as associated with the Pope, which is associated with Catholicism and communion. And those people are on their knees taking what could easily be argued as communion. So
Right.
you have the grape essence there because the blood and the bread.
Well, and if you think of the expansion that the yeast brings, and the Hierophant definitely brings
Yeah.
expansion of your spiritual practice and
Isn't
your
that cool?
spirituality. Yeah, it's so
Yeah.
cool. That would
So
give me
there's,
chills. I'm like,
yeah,
ooh.
it's interesting to me because I'm learning, like I said, I'm not Jewish, but I think there's so much, well, I 100% believe that I was Jewish in a recent past life. That to me
Right.
is non-negotiable. There's just too much.
It resonates with
There's
you.
there's too much
Mhm.
interest there, and there has been since I was little, like
Right.
little. So for me, it's always fascinating when you learn, having grown up Christian, but also having grown up with a mother that taught you pagan things, and then now taking the Judaism side of things, and you start wrapping it all together because you have a Pope card. It's an esoteric card that is associated typically with paganism. That's what people see tarot as, right? Witchcraft, paganism, whatever. And then
Right.
you add, yeah, but here are the original. Look at the Marseilles deck. It's just really interesting to me.
Yeah, that's cool.
So that's the two things I got is you're gonna make your French toast. Challah bread is amazing.
Holla.
Yeah, it's the best by far. For a lot of different reasons.
Right.
So the only other thing I had before I wanted to talk about wine was, do you know who Rumi is, the Persian poet?
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, so this is one that I came across. It's been, I don't know how long ago, and it's always stuck out to me because of the teachings that I got in the church, which I don't remember too terribly many. I think I was like 13, 14 when I stopped attending church, because I was like, I'm not going. And so before a garden, a vine, or a grape existed in this world, our souls were intoxicated with immortal wine.
Ooh,
Isn't that a
that's a Rumi
cool?
quote.
Yeah, that's a Persian.
Love it.
It's a Persian. For those of you who aren't familiar, he's a Persian poet. Most people have seen, like, especially with the names, it's like Rumi, but they actually don't know who that is. That is a real person. That's not like a website or some
Right.
whatever. But that is a quote that is associated with him that has been verified.
That's really cool. That's beautiful.
Yeah. So and wine is where I really get interested in the whole
Yeah.
grape thing. So
Go for it. Let's hear. I want to
Oh,
hear
you
about
want
the
me to?
wine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked about wine as an association, particularly through 22 teachings and our Tu B'Shvat stuff. And I'm not a really big drinker. I never really have been. It's something that I've consciously chosen not to do. But wine fascinates me. And it's always fascinated me because essentially it's rotted fruit. That's
Right.
what you're dealing with. You're
Right.
dealing with, you know what I'm saying? I mean, all of it's something that's had yeast and yes, but wine has always interested me because of the vastness of not just, it's all over the world. And
Right.
it has this sacredness to it, but at the same time, we have so many different wines. And it was always fascinating to me. I am not a wine snob by any means. I know there is red, white, blush. I know certain
Right.
things, Chardonnays, whatever.
I
Like, I
actually
know very
hate red
limited.
wine. I cannot do red wine. I can do
Yeah, I
white
don't like
wine,
red
but
wine.
I always wanted to like it because it's beautiful. It looks pretty and it goes down warm and it just looks very sensual as far as an experience. And I
I've
tried
yet
and
to,
I'm like,
yeah.
I've never found a red that I can love, but that's just
So
me.
the thing that always interested me is that some of them you chill and some of them you don't. Like, it's so vast, and the way that it's not only across the world, but the different types that you have, the ways that they're so different from one another. I mean, you literally, some of them you have to serve chilled, and then other ones it's straight up room temperature. And I'm like, that's interesting. And at the end of the day, it's rotten fruit. It's
Right.
fruit that is, you know what I'm saying?
Yum.
It's fermented. So to me, and to think of the way that a rotten fruit can be intoxicating is very interesting to me. So
It
it's just
is.
something that's always been there. But this was some stuff that I wanted to make sure. When we talk about wine and this association with wine, we were talking about how Noah was the first one to become intoxicated, the first biblical patriarch. And so you think of, like, in the Bible, when it says that, yes, he may have physically consumed wine and became intoxicated, or did he metaphorically connect with God? That is the metaphors, that he drank the wine, when in reality it was receiving the divine lineage or love, the wisdom through the vine. Does that make
Yeah,
sense the way
it
I'm saying
does.
it?
It
So
does.
it's just always interesting to me when you get into that, if you can take your bias and set it aside and reread some of this stuff, and you're like, it's not talking about the actual physical consumption of wine. It's not talking about the actual, now he may have actually planted a vineyard after the flood. That is very true. And I believe he probably did, just because of how, important grapes are. But it's more of he planted the vine for the believers, the true lineage, divine, because the flood wiped out everybody who's supposed to be impure and blah blah. Does that make sense?
It
The
does.
way
It
that if you
does.
re-look at it, so when you look at wine, you can look at it within the light of, yeah, you may have grown up in the church being told that, I am the vine and this wine or grape juice is my blood and you were consuming of me. But it's almost like, if you can take a step back, it's that taking in an integration of divine knowledge, of the mysteries, of the way that what is esoteric. Does that make sense? The
It does.
exoteric is the glass
It
of wine.
does.
The esoteric is what you are actually energetically, spiritually consuming.
Right. Consuming knowledge, consuming divine,
Yeah.
this presence. Yeah.
So yeah. And so anyways, there's that. And then the alchemy, but I'm going to let you say which you need to tell me about, because I know we're going to get into this alchemy discussion. So
Sure. This is just jumping to more modern times because, I like to find the little wrinkles that are more pop culture. And so there's this great story from, do you like the show I Love Lucy? Or, I mean, who doesn't
Oh
love I
yeah.
Love Lucy? I mean, I know it's an
Yeah.
old one, but it's still modern times, especially based on what we're talking about versus ancient times. So there's this great iconic scene. You probably can even picture it. Most
Oh,
people
where
have
she's
seen it.
mashing the grapes?
Grape
Yes.
stomping. So they were filming that, and I guess they were filming that actually in Italy. And they actually wanted, so her counterpart, there was a woman with her in the scene that was stomping the grapes with her.
Hmm.
And they wanted to find somebody that was like a true Italian villager for where they were. So they actually went and found somebody who wasn't an actress per se, but was a local who actually
Hmm.
worked, I believe, in the harvesting of the grapes. And they brought her in, and she spoke very little English, so it was kind of a little bit of a, a divide in the communication. But they started the scene, and of course, Lucy's doing her thing that she does. Lucille Ball's doing her amazing physical comedy she does,
Comedy. Yeah.
and something happens, and she accidentally slips and like kind of like pushes the woman. The woman took it seriously. Even in the filming, she was not understanding this was part of the bit. And she got mad and punched her. And Lucille Ball went down. And everybody thinks this is all just part of the shtick. But she went down, and they started fighting. And the woman was pushing her face down into this juicy slush of grapes and juice. And she said, she literally tells the story like, she's like, I almost died. She's like, I couldn't come up for air. I'm trying to get help. They're not understanding. They're not even cutting the scene. They're, they're like, and
Wow.
she's like, grapes and slush are just going up my nose, down my throat. I'm literally about to die. And so I just thought this was fascinating that nobody knew that this was actually a pretty serious little fight scene that was going on. But she apparently did an interview, and she said, but to drown in Nevada grapes is not the way I had planned to go. I just adore her. So, and I can see her just owning that. But what I also loved about that story, going back to the rebirth of grapes, is if you look at Lucille Ball's whole career, she was kind of a B movie actress for many, 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 many years long. And she was a model. She did all these things that were not getting her anywhere as far as big fame. And it wasn't until she started, got found as this comedic actress and became I Love Lucy that we all know, that her career, you could say, literally went a rebirth, because she was kind of getting up there in age as far as acting goes, as far as Hollywood goes. And I think, her story is kind of a unique one. She didn't just get discovered at some young 18-year-old
Yeah.
age. She was older for, as far as actresses went. She had been in the industry for years and years, working her butt off, and was kind of an unknown. And so you can literally say her whole career, went through a rebirth when she became this amazing icon we all know. But I love the thought that I
And
just
it's
thought that was
interesting.
crazy. She was dying and they didn't even know.
Well, and it's kind of like the other side of it is because of I Love Lucy, if people are not familiar with her career, because of the things that she went through. Yes, she was a comedian, but she was a staunch defender of women. I mean,
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen her when there's a couple of different times where she's like being interviewed on a show and stuff like that. And she's older at this point. But somebody would say in something that we would not classify as offensive, or is kind of, I mean, today we might, right, but back then it was like just how women were treated, something that
Right.
would be said. And she was like, don't talk to her like that. She would stop an interview
Right.
whenever like somebody they're asking somebody in the audience, do you want to ask Lucy a question? The lady would ask the question, and maybe he had a condescending remark, and to us we'd be like, hell no, they wouldn't say anything like that. But back then that was commonplace. And it was interesting, watch her interviews, how many times that she's like, don't talk to her like that, don't
Yeah.
touch her. Like, she's very much about, don't put your hand on her shoulder, don't
Right.
talk to her like. And it's interesting because of the way that like you're talking about the rebirth of her career, but it was also about her. So it's very much that sacrifice. She sacrificed herself like the lamb for her career, but it rebuilt her in a new way. And
Right.
look, she's an icon now. I mean, she's a
Exactly.
legend at this point. So
Exactly.
I have, it should be no surprise to you, obviously, but as somebody that practices alchemy and ritual high magic, wine is very important to us for that same reason. It is something that is taught that in order for something to be alchemized, right, to turn something base into gold, which in the olden days they would say to turn lead into gold. It's
Right.
really about the purification of the soul, right? The purification of us, our body, our soul. We watch what we eat, we watch what we consume, just physically, but emotionally, mentally, what's on TV, all of those things. And so when we're going through that process, it's said that you are fermenting like wine. So it begins with the taking of the base material, which is what grapes are seen as. It's the base material, the lead, and breaking it down, the fermentation process, and rebuilding it into something new, which is the gold. That's where the alchemy happens. So for us, if you ever see somebody refer to, especially if they talk about being a ceremonial or ritual high magician in the Western mystery tradition, they're talking about wine, they're talking about alchemy. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about something, breaking it down, fermenting it, completely changing it. That fermentation is that, which is a whole other thing, but that's the hanged man. You're in that middle ground, that fermentation, and then you get into the world, which is the alchemy, the evolution, which you actually get in temperance, which is interesting that it's temperance, and we're talking about wine, and you had the temperance movement. But it's a very potent symbol for alchemy. And
Right.
a lot of ritual magicians use wine in their ceremonies. And if they are battling addiction, have overcome addiction, or just don't partake in wine, they will use grape juice, which is, again, interesting. You see it in Judaism, you see it in Christianity. And then you have these ritual high magicians, which a lot of it's based off of that. That's why it's Western mystery tradition.
I think that's just that's so cool. The whole process of winemaking can be likened to that then, is essentially what you're
That's
saying,
what
right?
that's what
Yeah.
it's talking about. Yeah. So
Yeah.
if you ever hear somebody talking about making wine, or they're in the fermentation process, that's what it's talking about.
Right.
Wine is fascinating because it's a double transformation. You have a grape, that base material, you crush it. Now you have grape juice, but it's not actually fully alchemized, or the philosopher's stone, the gold, until it's gone through the full fermentation process and been completely transformed and changed.
Well, and also part of the winemaking process is aging, allowing the time for it to
Correct.
age and ferment even more. And that you could definitely say that any spiritual alchemy truly takes time. There's
And
got to be an element of time passage
and
for it
it
to
takes
truly
place
take
in the
root.
it takes place in the dark. And that's the other
Ooh,
side.
yes,
So it's in the
yes.
darkness. It's not
Yeah,
in broad daylight that this happens. The
right,
fruit grows in broad daylight. The crushing then happens. And then it is through the darkness the alchemical process happens.
right. Oh,
And
that
I
one
will
gave me chills. That's
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to me. So if you have ever wondered why wine is so prevalent in a lot of religious or spiritual belief systems, that's why. That's the other
right.
side of it. It's not just the divine wisdom, the mysteries, the divine love. It is also that it is symbolic of the fermentation and alchemical process itself.
I love that. That's beautiful.
So, do you have any words of wisdom of, let's say that somebody picks up their grocery order and they accidentally have a bunch of grapes in their order that they did not order, but it ended up in their grocery order. What do you think?
What would they
What
do?
would
Should
it
they
mean?
do with them? Or
Well,
will
no,
they?
they should
Oh,
eat them. But I mean,
like
what,
eat them.
symbolically, like the way, that's one way that grapes has actually shown up for me. It's ended up in my grocery order and I didn't order them.
Oh, that's great.
Ironically, it happened yesterday. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, I think that first and foremost, it's there's such an abundance energy with grapes because they're literally the most abundant fruit. Just about, they're abundant in history, but there's also all the deeper spiritual stuff. So definitely abundance is coming in, but all those little tiny rebirths that you undergo in your life, like what little rebirth are you going through right now? Because rebirths don't have to be gigantic. They don't have to
Right.
be. They can be the little ones, the little rebirths. What little transformations and rebirths are you undergoing, or are you about to undergo right now that's coming in for you?
And a big thing that I would ask is, if you are in a spiritual or religious belief system, or, under training of a teacher or a mentor or anything like that, what are you studying right now? That would be the first thing I asked, especially if
Yeah,
wine and like, what are you, look at what you're learning that
right.
has to deal with spiritual or religious belief systems. Because again, we're talking about that alchemical thing. And it is through alchemy that we get abundance. I say this all the time and people think I'm full of crap. I am not a fan of manifestation work. I believe that when you move into divine alignment, whether that's God, spirit, all universe, Allah, Shiva, whatever term you want to use, when you move into divine alignment or divine will, manifestation occurs naturally. So if you have that wine or those grapes come in, you get the abundance by taking a step back. Does that make sense? Like you
It
don't have to
does.
be directly in the line of, I'm going to manifest $1 million this year. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Yeah. And
So
I
I
think
think,
I think that's too bad that more people don't see that process that way, because
yeah.
that's actually a pretty keen insight on like how to better tap into that.
Yeah, well, and what I find with manifestation work is that when you manifest something that is not in divine alignment or will, it doesn't stick around very long.
Right.
You may get it, but it doesn't stick around. It's kind of one of the reasons I often see people, you talk about those like lottery winners, right? But they end up broke, deceased. Does that make sense? Like there's the
Yeah.
dark side of wealth, which is
Yeah.
interesting to me too. So that's just something to consider. I mean, if they are to show up in your life, how are they showing up? Are they full grapes? Are they smashed grapes? Are they grape juice? Is it wine? And then I would look at, are we dealing with red wine or grapes, black, green, white? Well, I guess they're not really white, they're more opaque. They even have cotton candy grapes.
I have had those. Yes.
Oh, I don't like super sweet grapes, so I haven't tried this, but I was like, cotton candy grapes, I have to look those up.
Right.
So I think if you're going to look at it, it's a matter of literally looking at the physical attributes of it to tell you a little bit more.
Sure.
And then also looking at, you know, I would say the red or the black is more in alignment with like the blood, and the green or the opaque is more, to me, that says alchemy. The alchemical process, if it's green, it could even be worldly affairs. So you start combining the color combinations. Is it in physical form? Is it in juice? Is it in wine? That's what I would say. Because I know if you pay attention, they show up.
Yeah.
If you pay attention. I showed you this morning all the feathers I got on
I
my
know.
hike.
That was
Just watch where
awesome.
they are.
Yeah. But
So
one of the things I love is whenever anytime you and I plan an episode and we say, okay, let's do grapes next. And then all of a sudden, both of us are sending each other, oh, look what I just saw. Oh, look what I just saw.
I know.
Like it starts mirroring back to us.
Yeah.
I love that.
Well, like I said yesterday I ended up I have a huge thing of grapes that ended up in my grocery order. I went back and I checked my receipt and it's on my receipt. And I'm like, I did not put that in my basket though.
That's
Like
wild.
I did
Yeah.
not, I went with cherries.
Right.
Because I try not to get too much fruit at one time. And first of all, the kids wipe it out. But then the other hand of that is sometimes they'll go bad because there's just too much fruit at one time.
Yeah.
I chose cherries. I'm like, where did this huge container of grapes? I did not put that in my basket. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's very interesting. It is absolutely fantastical. All right, Jen. Well, I think that wraps up our episode 4. Grapes. Ching, ching,
Okay, I
ching,
have
ching.
one last thing to end on. I used to have the
okay.
best t-shirt from a winery I went to, and I don't have it anymore, but it said, pick me, squeeze me, make me wine.
Oh, good God.
And I
Yes.
just, we'll end with that.
Do you still have that shirt?
I don't. I was so sad. I
Okay.
don't have it anymore.
I was about to say, I greatly appreciate you not wearing that shirt
Pick me,
today.
Oh, I would have worn it. You know I would have.
But you did, I know, but
did
you
bring
have your
my-
prop today.
bring my
You have your
grapes.
prop.
You have to eat them like this.
Yes, that's how they have them depicted in all the
Luxuriously. That's right.
classical art.
Recumbent.
Well, we want to thank our listeners and our viewers, whether you're catching us on YouTube or podcast, for joining us for the episode of The Grapes. And we look forward to speaking with you next time as we talk about the turtle.
Woohoo. Here comes some turtle action.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.